Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 55, Reconstruction Acts, the Railroad, and women's suffrage. Howard G. Cunningham is an American computer programmer who created the first wiki and is a frontiers person in his field. He also has a pretty good sense of humor. As the legend goes, Cunningham is credited with the sentiment, the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask a question, it's to post the wrong answer. This refers to the adherence that people are swift to correct a wrong answer than to answer a question. An expert will likely correct you. And in this method, someone will give you an exhaustive knowledge on the topic you are curious about. This line of thinking has been anointed Cunningham's Law. The law has been used to explain how other online communities, such as Twitter, work. The term emerged itself in 2010. Cunningham declines ownership of the law, naming it a, quote, misquote that disproves itself by propagating through the internet, end quote. The law is reminiscent of a French adage, preach the falsehood to know the truth. You might need mental gymnastics to find a historical case of Cunningham's Law, but there are plenty of examples of false information purposely being disseminated. According to the 2016 Scientific American article, 3 Historical Examples of Fake News by Crystal DaCosta, in 1782, Benjamin Franklin, made a manufactured issue of a Boston newspaper. The main story was particularly gruesome. It claimed that American forces had uncovered sacks of money and goods that seemed bound for the king, but contained among them, including the scalps of soldiers and civilians. A shipment of scalps contained a letter addressed to the king asking him to take the scalps as a token of goodwill and loyalty. Franklin sent the newspaper to his friends, who delivered it to their friends, and soon enough, other colonial newspapers had republished the account. There were signs the actual document was a bogus typeface, for instance, but these clues were lost in the sensationalism of the news. The public was outraged. Franklin's report added to the hostility against Native Americans in this case, and helped to point them as non-Americans who could not be entrusted nor should be tolerated in the new republic. Americans later revived the story and proved the horrors of Native Americans in future military campaigns against the natives. Posting a falsehood to get the facts occasionally works because people love appearing more intelligent than others. And while the thrill of dopamine that comes with making a stranger feel foolish is more powerful motivator than responding to a question, the substance of those responses is likely to be way more harmful. That means that through a number of people posting inaccurate data in search of accurate answers is probably minuscule. You can't trust the frenzied revisions posted in reply to any objectionable area you experience online, even if the poster unpretentiously presents it. People aren't usually interested in being accommodating, but they are interested in getting the rank of the most competent person in the room. If everyone in the meeting is confused about a particular topic, toss out a ridiculous solution. If nobody can improve on it, then the final solution wins. Cunningham's Law has crept into academia unwittingly for years. Case in point, those throwaway multiple choice or true or false questions on 100-level courses are so obviously wrong that the student can easily discern the truth. I am one such professor who softballs in these quizzes. For those keeping score at home, I always throw at least one question in my examinations with the wrong answer of John C. Reilly, the actor famous for the movie Talladega Nights. Why? His name sounds like a railroad tycoon or 19th century abolitionist. Those who know will get a chuckle. I'm not here to say students are dense, but they mostly come from an area of fledgling expertise. Any positive reinforcement can push them to gather some confidence.
Reconstruction Acts. The Reconstruction Acts were 4 statutes passed during the Reconstruction era by the 14th United States Congress addressing the provision for the Southern states to be readmitted to the Union. The actual title of the initial legislation was an act to provide for the more efficient government of the rebel states, passed on March 4, 1867. Completing the acts required the former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union from military and federal control imposed during and after the American Civil War. The acts excluded Tennessee, which had already ratified the 14th Amendment and had been readmitted to the Union on July 24, 1866. The succession of Andrew Johnson to the presidency following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was initially supported by radicals in Congress, who thought Johnson's policies would be more punitive and far-reaching than Lincoln's. However, Johnson took a conciliatory approach and inflicted almost no punishment on the South, even as Southern states passed the Black Codes and sent Confederates to Congress. Reconstruction began under the Union Army, which enforced policies helping their military goals. Johnson sought to finish Reconstruction by December 1865, before Congress would meet again. He was unsuccessful at this goal, and when Congress met in 1866, they passed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, both over Johnson's veto. Johnson's hostility to congressional plans led to growing discontent in Congress with his administration. The midterm elections of 1866 produced a resounding acceptance of radical policy and rejection of Johnson's. Support grew among congressional Republicans to wipe away the current Johnson state governments and their abuses and to create new governments. The passage of the Reconstruction Acts marks the advent of congressional reconstruction. The acts set forth the conditions for the late rebel states to regain entry into the Union. For re-entry, each state had to draft a new state constitution, which would have to be authorized by Congress. These constitutions would have to enfranchise the freedmen and abolish the Black Codes. A vital addition of the acts included the creation of 5 military districts in the South, each commanded by a general, which would serve as the highest authority for the region. However, few generals were involved in the day-to-day affairs, notably after officials passed new constitutions. The states were also required to ratify the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Congress overrode President Andrew Johnson's vetoes of these measures. General George Meade of the 3rd Military District appointed Brigadier General Thomas H. Ruger to replace Governor of Georgia Charles J. Jenkins, who had been elected as the only candidate in 1865 to succeed James Johnson, who President Andrew Johnson had appointed. After ex parte McCardle came before the United States Supreme Court, Congress feared that the court might strike the Reconstruction Acts unconstitutional. To avert this, Congress rescinded the Habeas Corpus Act of 1867, stopping the Supreme Court's jurisdiction over the case.
Fourteenth Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved people, and assured all citizens equal protection of the laws. One of 3 amendments passed during the Reconstruction era to abolish slavery and establish civil and legal rights for Black Americans would become the basis for many landmark Supreme Court decisions over the years. In its later sections, the 14th Amendment allowed the federal government to punish states that violated or abridged their citizens' right to vote by proportionally lessening the state's representation in Congress and mandated that anyone who engaged in insurrection against the United States could not hold civil, military or elected office without the approval of 2/3 of the House and Senate. Abraham Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 left his successor, President Andrew Johnson, to handle the complex process of integrating former Confederate states back into the Union after the Civil War and establishing formerly enslaved people as free and equal citizens. Johnson, a Democrat from Tennessee, supported emancipation, but he differed significantly from the Republican-controlled Congress in his view of how Reconstruction should proceed. Johnson showed comparable leniency toward the former Confederate states as they were reintroduced into the Union. But many Northerners were outraged when the newly elected Southern state legislatures, largely dominated by former Confederate leaders, enacted Black Codes, which were repressive laws that strictly regulated the behavior of Black citizens and virtually kept them conditional on white planters. In creating the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Congress used the power given to enforce the newly ratified 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and defended the rights of Black Americans. Johnson vetoed the bill, and though Congress successfully overrode his veto and made it into law in April 1866, the first time in history that Congress overrode a presidential veto of a substantial bill, even some Republicans thought another amendment was critical to provide firm constitutional grounds for the new legislation. In late April, Representative Thaddeus Stevens introduced a plan that combined several different legislative proposals: civil rights for Black people, How to apportion representatives in Congress, punitive measures against the former Confederate States of America, and repudiation of Confederate war debt, into a single constitutional amendment. After the House and Senate voted on the amendment by June 1866, they submitted it to the states for ratification. President Johnson fought the 14th Amendment as it made its way through the ratification process, but congressional elections in late 1866 gave Republicans veto-proof majorities in both the House and Senate. Southern states also opposed it, but Congress needed them to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments as a condition of regaining representation in Congress. The ongoing presence of the Union Army in the former Confederate states ensured their compliance. On July 9, 1868, Louisiana and South Carolina voted to ratify the 14th Amendment, making up the necessary 3/4 majority. The opening sentence of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment defined U.S. citizenship: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. This repudiated the Supreme Court's notorious 1857 Dred Scott decision. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that a black man could not claim citizenship rights under the federal Constitution, even if born free.
Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Treaty of Fort Laramie is an agreement between the United States and the Oglala, Miniconjou, and Brule bands of Lakota people, Yanktonai Dakota, Arapaho Nation, following the failure of the first Fort Laramie Treaty, signed in 1851. The treaty was forged to end a 2-year campaign of raids and ambushes along the Bozeman Trail, a shortcut thousands of white migrants were using to reach the gold mines in Montana Territory. The treaty is divided into 17 articles. It established the Great Sioux Reservation, including ownership of the Black Hills, and set aside additional lands as unceded Indian Territory in South Dakota, Wyoming, Nebraska, and possibly Montana. It established that the U.S. government would hold the authority to punish white settlers who committed crimes against the tribes and tribe members who committed crimes and were to be delivered to the government rather than to face charges in tribal courts. It stipulated that the government would abandon forts along the Bozeman Trail. It included several provisions designed to encourage a transition to farming and move the tribes closer to the white man's way of life. The treaty protected specified rights of third parties not partaking in the negotiations and effectively ended Red Cloud's War. That provision did not include the Ponca, who was not a party to the treaty and so had no opportunity to object when the American treaty negotiators inadvertently broke a separate treaty with the Ponca by unlawfully selling the entirety of the Ponca reservation to the Lakota, according to Article 2 of this treaty. The United States never intervened to return the Ponca land. Instead, the Lakota claimed the Ponca land as their own and set about attacking and demanding tribute from the Ponca until 1876, when U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant chose to resolve the situation unilaterally by ordering the Ponca removed to the Indian Territory. The removal, known as the Ponca Trail of Tears, was carried out by force the following year and resulted in over 200 deaths. The treaty was negotiated by government-appointed Indian Peace Commission members and signed between April and November 1868 at and near Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory. The final signatories were Red Cloud himself and others who accompanied him. Animosities over the agreement arose quickly, with neither side fully honoring the terms. Open war again broke out in 1876, and the U.S. government unilaterally annexed native land protected under the treaty in 1877. Although the treaty required the consent of 3/4 of the men of the tribes, many did not sign or recognize the results. Others would later complain that the treaty contained complex language that was not well explained to avoid arousing suspicion. Yet others would not thoroughly learn the terms of the agreement until 1870, when Red Cloud returned from a trip to Washington, D.C. The treaty overall, and in comparison with the 1851 agreement, represented a departure from earlier considerations of tribal customs and demonstrated the government's more heavy-handed position concerning tribal nations, and desire to assimilate the Sioux into American property arrangements and social customs. According to one source, animosities over the treaty arose almost immediately when a group of Miniconjous informed they were no longer welcome to trade at Fort Laramie, south of their newly established territory. This was notwithstanding that the treaty did not stipulate that the tribes could not travel outside their land, only that they would not permanently occupy outside land. The only travel expressly forbidden by the treaty was that of white settlers onto the reservation. Although a treaty between the U.S. and the Sioux, it profoundly affected the Crow tribe since it held the title to some of the territories set aside in the new treaty. By entering the peace talks, the government had betrayed the Crows, who had willingly helped the army to hold the Bozeman Trail posts. When the Sioux Indians stopped the advance of the U.S. in 1868, they quickly resumed their own program of expansions into the adjoining Indian territories. Although all parties took and gave, the Sioux and their allies once again threatened the homeland of some of the Indian nations around them. Attacks on the Crows and the Shoshones were frequent, both by the Northern Cheyennes and by the Arapahoes, as well as the Sioux, and by parties made up from all three tribes. The Crows reported Sioux Indians in the Bighorn area from 1871. The Sioux took this eastern part of the Crow reservation a few years later in quest of buffalo. When a force of Sioux warriors confronted a Crow reservation camp at Pryor Creek in 1873 throughout the day, Crow Chief Blackfoot called for decisive actions against the Indian intruders by the U.S. In 1876, the Crows, and the Eastern Shoshones, fought alongside the army at the Rosebud. They scouted for Custer against the Sioux, who were now in the old Crow country. The tribes and the government chose to ignore the treaty portions or comply only as long as conditions met their favor. Between 1869 and 1876, at least 7 separate skirmishes occurred near Fort Laramie. Before the Black Hills expedition, Army sources mentioned attacks in Montana north of Yellowstone. They were north of the Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, carried out by unidentified groups of Sioux. Large war parties of Sioux Indians left their reservation to attack distant Indian enemies near like a fishhook village. The first talks of actions against the Sioux arose. In his 1873 report, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs advocated that those Sioux Indians roaming west of the Dakota line be forced by the military to come into the Great Sioux Reservation. The government eventually broke the treaty's terms following the Black Hills Gold Rush and George Armstrong Custer's expedition into the area in 1874. It failed to prevent white settlers from moving onto tribal lands. Rising tensions eventually led to open conflict in the Great Sioux War of 1876. The 1868 treaty would be modified 3 times by the U.S. Congress between 1876 and 1889, taking more land originally granted, including unilaterally seizing the Black Hills in 1877.
Transcontinental Railroad. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act chartered the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroad companies. It tasked them with building a transcontinental railroad linking the United States from east to west. Over the next 7 years, the two companies would race from Sacramento, California, on the one side, to Omaha, Nebraska, on the other, struggling against significant risks before they met at Promontory, Utah, on May 10, 1869. America's first steam locomotive made its debut in 1830, and over the next 2 decades, railroad tracks linked many cities on the East Coast. By 1850, some 9,000 miles of track had been laid east of the Missouri River. During that same period, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States. This trend increased dramatically after the discovery of gold in California in 1848. The overland journey across mountains, plains, rivers, and deserts was risky and challenging. Many westward migrants traveled by sea, taking the 6-month route around Cape Horn at the tip of South America or risking yellow fever and other diseases by crossing the Isthmus of Panama and traveling via ship to San Francisco. In 1845, the New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney presented a resolution in Congress proposing the federal funding of a railroad that would stretch to the Pacific. Over the next several years, lobbying efforts failed due to growing sectionalism in Congress, but the idea remained potent. In 1860, a young engineer named Theodore Judah identified the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California as an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1861, Judah had enlisted a group of investors in Sacramento to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. He then headed to Washington, where he could convince congressional leaders and President Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law the following year. The Pacific Railroad Act stipulated that the Central Pacific Railroad Company would start building in Sacramento and continue east across the Sierra Nevada. In contrast, a second company, the Union Pacific Railroad, would make westward from the Missouri River, near the Iowa-Nebraska border. The two lines of track would meet in the middle, and each company would receive 6,400 acres of land and $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track built. From the beginning, the Transcontinental Railroad was set up to compete between the two companies. In the West, the Central Pacific would be dominated by the Big Four: Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. All were ambitious businesspeople without prior experience with railroads, engineering, or construction. They borrowed heavily to finance the project and exploited legal loopholes to get the possible funds from the government for their planned track construction. Disillusioned with his partners, Judah planned to recruit new investors to buy them out. Still, he caught yellow fever while crossing the Isthmus of Panama on his way east and died in November 1863, soon after the Central Pacific had spiked its first rails to ties in Sacramento. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Dr. Thomas Durant had illegally achieved a controlling interest in the Union Pacific Railroad Company, giving him complete authority over the project. Though the Union Pacific celebrated its launch in early December 1863, little would be completed until the end of the Civil War in 1865. After General Grenville Dodge, a hero of the Union Army, took control as a chief engineer, the Union Pacific finally began to move westward in May 1866. The company suffered bloody attacks on its workers by Native Americans, including members of the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes who were understandably threatened by the progress of the white man and his iron horse across their native lands. Still, the Union Pacific moved relatively quickly across the plains, compared to the slow progress of their rival company through the Sierra. Ramshackle settlements popped up wherever the railroad went, turning into hotbeds of drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence, and producing the enduring mythology of the Wild West. In 1865, after struggling with retaining workers due to the difficulty of labor, Charles Crocker began hiring Chinese laborers. This was controversial at the time, as the Chinese were considered an inferior race due to pervasive racism. By that time, some 50,000 Chinese immigrants were living on the West Coast, many having arrived during the Gold Rush. The Chinese laborers proved to be tireless workers, and Crocker hired more. Some 14,000 were toiling under brutal working conditions in the Sierra Nevada by early 1867. To blast through the mountains, the Central Pacific built massive wooden trestles on the western slopes and used gunpowder and nitroglycerin to blast tunnels through the granite. By the summer of 1867, the Union Pacific was in Wyoming, covering nearly 4 times as much ground as the Central Pacific. However, the Central Pacific broke through the mountains in late June, and the hard part was finally behind them. Both companies then headed towards Salt Lake City, cutting many corners, including building shoddy bridges or sections of track that would have to be rebuilt later, in their race to get ahead. By early 1869, the companies were working only miles from each other. In March, the newly inaugurated President Ulysses S. Grant announced he would withhold federal funds until the two railroad companies agreed on a meeting point. They decided on Promontory Summit, north of the Great Salt Lake, some 690 track miles from Sacramento and 1,086 from Omaha. On May 10, after several delays, a crowd of workers and dignitaries watched as the final spike was driven, linking the Central Pacific and Union Pacific in the Golden Spike ceremony. The Golden Spike was made of 17.6 karat gold and was a gift of David Hughes, a San Francisco contractor and friend of Big Four member Leland Stanford. Stanford took the first swing at the spike during the ceremony but accidentally struck the tie instead. His attempt was followed by Union Pacific Thomas Durant's. Durant swung and missed, likely because of a hangover he was suffering from the previous evening's party in Ogden. A railroad worker ultimately drove the final spike at 12:47 p.m. on May 10, 1869. Telegraph cables immediately went out to President Grant and the country with the news that the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. The golden spike was removed after the ceremony and replaced with traditional iron spikes. 3 other ties, one of gold, one of silver and gold, and one of silver, were also presented at the ceremony. The original golden spike is now part of the Stanford University collection, founded by Leland Stanford and his wife, Jane, in 1885 in memory of their only son. The Transcontinental Railroad building opened the American West more rapid development. With the completion of the track, the line cut the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States from a matter of months to under a week. Connecting the two American coasts made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets more accessible than ever before. The railroad also facilitated westward expansion, escalating conflicts between Native American tribes and settlers who now had more accessible access to new territories.
Wyoming and suffrage. Wyoming was the first place in the world to give all women the ability to vote. However, other jurisdictions had already given limited suffrage to women with various property qualifications. A U.S. territory in 1869, Wyoming's first territorial legislature voted to give women the right to vote and to hold public office. A legislature made entirely of men passed the Woman's Suffrage Bill in 1869 entitled "And to grant the women of Wyoming Territory the right of suffrage, and to hold office." The territory retained its woman suffrage law even when that law could have jeopardized the Wyoming Territory's application for statehood. In 1890, Wyoming became the first U.S. state to allow its woman citizens to vote. The push for voting in Wyoming began when Wyoming was still part of the Dakota Territory. In 1867, the completion of the Union Pacific Railroad and the South Pass Gold Rush resulted in thousands of settlers pouring into the western Dakota Territory. Wyoming Territory emerged just south of the mountains where the Gold Rush occurred. The new territory included South Pass, the slow up and downhill rise where people crossed the Continental Divide for thousands of years along the Sweetwater River. Initially, the Sweetwater camps were located in Carter County, Dakota Territory, with South Pass City as the county seat. These new mining towns grew quickly and were along the path of the Union Pacific Railroad that used South Pass but was still being built. Dakota Territory agreed to cede its western lands to form Wyoming Territory. South Pass City remained the seat for the county that would be renamed Sweetwater several months later. Since most early miners hoped to strike it rich and quickly leave, they had little interest in governance or community services such as street repairs, indigent care, or schools. Attempts to erect a jail in South Pass City were defeated twice in special elections. The arrival of businesses and the first families in 1868 brought stability, for these residents wanted to transform the South Pass gold camps into permanent towns. 6. Because Wyoming was a territory, all officials were appointed, including the governor, county commissioners, county attorneys, justices of the peace, and town constables. Wyoming legislators were aware of the discussion over woman suffrage, for many of them had moved from Midwestern states where the reform had been debated for several years. In 1867, despite enormous pressure from women activists and a massive national effort, Kansas legislators failed to pass a law giving women the vote. Early in 1869, Dakota Territory passed a so-called woman suffrage bill within one vote. In Congress, a senator introduced a bill after the Civil War to give women in all the territories the right to vote. This failed, too, as did bills in 1868 that would have amended the U.S. Constitution to provide all women in the United States and territories the right to vote. Those failures led many advocates to believe the first woman suffrage bill would probably be adopted in a territory. Territories only required a majority vote of the legislature, and the governor's signature to pass a suffrage bill. States, on the other, required a constitutional amendment to add women's suffrage. That process required a 60% vote in both houses, the governor's acceptance, and the people's approval in a special election. Even so, Wyoming's territorial legislature, made up entirely of men, had to be persuaded that votes for women were a good idea. In addition to men willing to consider allowing women to vote, local women activists worked on behalf of the issue. 2 women had recently delivered speeches in Cheyenne in support of woman suffrage, Anna Dickinson at the courthouse in the fall and Redelia Bates to new legislators in November. However, neither the national woman suffrage organizations nor any grassroots movement in Wyoming lobbied for the passage of woman suffrage in the territory. Before the Wyoming delegates assembled in Cheyenne in October 1869, legislators had narrowly defeated woman suffrage bills in 3 western legislatures, Washington in 1854, Nebraska in 1856, and Dakota in 1869, and Utah and Colorado lawmakers would soon be considering the issue. After the Civil War, the 2 major political parties battled over expanding voting rights. A particularly fierce battle over suffrage for women and black men emerged in Kansas, where national suffrage organizations invested a lot of time and money. The effort failed in 1867 when the new state legislature, primarily Republican, voted down woman suffrage but supported suffrage for black men. The Republican Party had made suffrage for black men the heart of its political activity, but not all voters supported their views. Northern Democrats were uncertain that the killing was worth the cost during the Civil War. Many would have preferred compromising with the South instead of pursuing the fight to the bloody end. After the war, Democrats continued to oppose some of the most significant changes the war had brought about. In particular, they opposed full citizenship and voting rights for black people, both recently freed slaves and Northern blacks who had already been more or less accessible. In the fall of 1868, the famous Union Army General, Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican, was elected president. Grant soon appointed many loyal Republicans to run the brand new Wyoming Territory. His appointees included the Governor, John A. Campbell, Secretary of State Edward M. Lee, and Attorney General Joseph M. Carey, the top government lawyer in the state. They arrived in May 1869. Not long afterward, Carey issued an official legal opinion that no one in Wyoming could be denied the right to vote based on race. The federal law that eventually created the territory in 1868 banned voting and office-holding discrimination based on race. Many Democrats saw Carey's opinion as a move to make sure Wyoming's black people voted Republican, and the issue continued to be controversial. When a territory-wide election was held in early September, only Democrats were elected. The territory's new delegate to Congress was a Democrat, and all 22 members of the new territorial legislature were Democrats. One of those Democrats, William Bright, a saloon keeper at South Pass City in what became Wyoming Territory, lobbied hard for Wyoming Territory to become the first government in the world to guarantee women the right to vote. All white and male legislators had several reasons for supporting women's suffrage when they met for the first time in October 1869. They passed a resolution allowing women to sit inside the unique space where the lawmakers sat. They gave a law guaranteeing that teachers, most of whom were women, would be paid the same whether they were men or women. And they passed a bill ensuring married women's property rights are separate from their husbands. They were willing to go even further to get Wyoming good publicity that would draw more settlers to the new territory. Positive news stories published throughout the nation, legislators thought, might also bring more women. There were 6 adult men in the territory for every adult woman, and very few children. American Indians were not counted in these numbers, but Chinese workers, most of whom had come to work on the railroad, and black people were counted. Their decision was also about party politics. Democrats in the legislature hoped that once these women came to Wyoming, they would continue to vote for the party that had given them the vote in the first place. Democrats in the legislature wanted to make John Campbell, the Republican governor, look bad. As a man publicly supported rights for ex-slaves, they hoped to push him too far with a vote for women. If they passed the bill, many assumed Campbell would veto it. The bill passed the Legislative Council 6 votes to 2. In the House, lawmakers tried and failed to attach various amendments. Some potential amendments were attempts to make the bill so unattractive to other legislators that it would fail. One such amendment that failed would have extended the vote to all colored women and squaws. The House raised the voting age for women from 18 to 21. The House then passed the woman suffrage bill 7 votes to 4, with 1 abstention. Governor Campbell took several days to decide what to do. He signed the bill into law on December 10, 1869. Wyoming was one of 4 U.S. states that fully enfranchised their women by the end of the century, with Colorado, Utah, and Idaho.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.